Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with Amanda Udis-Kessler. Amanda is the author of a new book coming out soon from Pilgrim Press titled Abundant Lives, A Progressive Christian Ethic of Flourishing. She has another book coming out later this year titled Cultural Processes of Inequality, A Sociological Perspective, and she previously published Queer Inclusion in the United Methodist Church. She's one of the main contributors to the 2023 anthology titled A Liturgy for All Bodies, New Words for a New World. Amanda has essays, chapters, and other materials in an additional 13 books. She's a former sociology professor and holds a PhD in sociology from Boston College and a certificate from the Aleph School of Theology. Amanda also composes progressive sacred music and also offers anti-racism and anti-oppression training specifically as a white person for other white people. She is a covenant partner, musician, and lay worship leader at Vista Grande United Church of Christ in Colorado Springs, and is a regular visiting speaker at the Progressive Christianity Network Britain St. Albans group. So as you can tell, Amanda is really busy and really involved in a lot of wonderful things. So Amanda, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
I need to also mention that you can learn more about Amanda's writing at amandaudis-kessler.com. Let me spell that. It's AMANDAUDISKESSLER.com. And more about her music at queersacredmusic.com. Awesome. So, Amanda, is there anything else that you'd like people to know about you than what I just mentioned?
Well, that introduction does cover most of it, but I'll add three things. First, I utterly adore cats. Second, I'm a huge fan of British baking shows and police procedurals. And third, I think I own every professional recording of the musical Godspell ever released in
Oh
English.
my goodness, that's cool. Well, that and the British baking shows. I mean, my wife and I are hooked on that too. So they're really fun. So a couple different things we want to chat about today. But first, let's talk about the new book. You know, as I mentioned, it's titled Abundant Lives, A Progressive Christian Ethic of Flourishing. So what led you to write that book?
So my approach to ethics was originally inspired by the open letter that a right-wing media personality, Joe the Plumber Wurzelbacher, wrote after a 2014 mass shooting, in which he told the parents of the kids killed in the shooting that their dead kids did not matter as much as his constitutional gun rights.
Mm,
The project unfolded from my response to that statement. And
mm,
for years, I developed the ideas in the first half of the book while preaching in Unitarian Universalist churches. And as the years went by, a series of sermons turned into a book-length project and
mm.
underwent a few twists and turns in direction, such as moving from a secular approach to ethics, which is where it started, to one in relationship with progressive Christianity, which is where it ended. But I knew from early on that this was a big enough and complicated enough set of ideas that it was going to eventually need to appear in book form.
And I need to say it's an excellent book. I mean, it's a unique, at least for my reading, a unique perspective that's very helpful in a lot of different ways. So for those of you that follow our blog, you'll see some excerpts from that coming in a couple of months. Can you please describe for folks what the arc of the book is, the overall, theme
Sure.
and path?
So I start by arguing that ethics should be based on human well-being, not on abstract principles like rights or freedom, because those principles can be used either for human well-being or to cause human suffering. I then lay out 10 attributes that are core to what it means to be a human being. So for example, we are embodied beings, emotional beings, relational beings, meaning-making beings, and so on. I argue that we largely flourish and suffer through these attributes, and that systemic inequality blocks our flourishing and causes suffering, especially for members of socially devalued groups. The first half of the book then lays out and elaborates on a set of claims that moral values, beliefs, actions, and institutions are those that promote human flourishing, while immoral or morally problematic values, beliefs, actions, and institutions are those that block flourishing or cause avoidable human suffering. The second half of the book puts these ideas in conversation with contemporary progressive Christianity. So I start there by noting some what I call proto-flourishing ideas in the life of Jesus, the values of the prophets, and the practices of early Christian communities. I then consider the relationship between love, flourishing, and concepts of God. I conclude that we can love God, ourselves, our neighbors, and our enemies by tending to our own flourishing, their flourishing, and the flourishing of creation. And as I say this now, flourishing sounds really vague and broad, but in fact, what I mean by it turns out to be very concrete, because flourishing is tied to human attributes like embodiment. To flourish bodily, we need access to survival resources such as food, water, shelter, and medical care. We need safety from harm, trauma, and violence. And we need freedom to use our bodies in ways that bring pleasure and a sense of efficacy. So, for example, working against hunger, poverty, sexual assault, and war are concrete ways to help people flourish and thus live out our commitment to love God, ourselves, and others. And the final two chapters of the book focus on the work we do as individuals and church communities to live into this very challenging invitation.
I mean, so one of the things I like about the book that you can tell from what you just described is that it spans different levels, right? You know, it's one perspective, it's kind of academic, you know, and depth of rigor and thought and articulation, but at the same time, incredibly practical, you know, and which many times I get frustrated by books that, you know, will be really great at analysis, but they don't say anything about what do we do about it or very little about that, you know, and I like how yours, you know, spans that.
Thank you.
I'd like to read an endorsement for the book from none other than our wonderful friend, Brian McLaren. He says the book is beautifully written, deep yet easily accessible, and so comprehensive. It offers us one of the best introductions to progressive Christian living I have ever seen. Now, that is a serious comment from none other than Brian McLaren, who's seen it all, right? I mean, what book in the progressive Christian space has he probably never seen, right, or read, or asked to comment on, whatever? So how would you say that the book is an introduction to progressive Christian living?
Well, first, I have to say I was absolutely gobsmacked when I saw that endorsement. I really was not expecting anything quite like that. But whether the book is as good as he thinks or not, I agree that it is an introduction to progressive Christian living. So as I understand it, progressive Christianity unfolds from Jesus's two great commandments, love of the holy, however we understand the holy, and love of other people. Christianity that is specifically progressive invites us to live into this love and live it out in the context of the modern world with humility, respect for other approaches to religion and spirituality, and a deep appreciation for the wisdom of science. The core religious claim in the book is that we love ourselves by attending concretely to our own flourishing and minimizing our own suffering. And we love others, including our enemies, by attending to their flourishing and minimizing their suffering. We can do this as individuals, but because so much suffering is large scale and systemic, we also have to do it collectively by working against racism, sexism, and other forms of inequality, by struggling against authoritarianism, violence, and war, and by restoring our damaged ecosystem. That is a lot of work, and we are doing it in the face of individuals and social systems with, to put it generously, different values and priorities. So the final two chapters of the book are specifically about progressive Christian living. Chapter 6 addresses our need to cultivate virtues that will help us flourish and discusses spiritual formation and psychological healing work that may be able to help us cultivate those virtues. And finally, Chapter 7 addresses issues of justice and how church communities can live into progressive Christian virtues.
So as I said, it's quite comprehensive, you know, in scope at the same time as being very, you know, pragmatic. So I love that. So in the book's description, it says let me start that over. The book's description says it invites sociologically informed engagement in human well-being based on Jesus' command to love God, our neighbors, ourselves, and our enemies. So for those of us that are less sociologically informed, can you tell us what that means?
Sure. So most ethics is developed by ethicists who are working within the discipline of philosophy. And most of the time, they build their ethical approaches around abstract concepts like freedom or justice or equality, and they then use philosophical reasoning practices to elaborate on them. And that I'm not doing that at all. Instead, I start with sociology. What do we know about what people are like based on empirical research and the systemic study of social patterns? What do we know from a social scientific perspective about what people need, about what they fear, and about what hurts them? So in that sense, tying flourishing to human attributes like embodiment or meaning making, creativity, and the others is sociological, though there are some philosophers like Martha Nussbaum who've done something similar. The other piece of the book that feels very sociological to me is the observation that freedom, justice, rights, and similar principles are not inherently morally good in real life. I think we're really used to thinking of these things as kind of inherent goods. You know, freedom is always good, more freedom is always better, and so on. But in fact, sociologically speaking, it really depends on how these concepts are being used.
Yeah.
One of the examples I give in the book has to, because I mentioned shootings several times, mass shootings, gun rights language, which is a form of rights language, is often used in ways that turns out to deny other people the right of safety in public places, because we can't really feel safe in public places if there's a real chance we might be shot in a mass shooting. Another example, I may mention it briefly, but I don't talk much about it, is the way the anti-abortion movement uses right to life language. So again, this is rights language, but the legal and political upshot of that language turns out to limit women's rights, particularly women's reproductive rights. So again, we have to be really careful. These terms can be used for good to help flourishing. They also can be used in ways that harm people. So it's interesting to bring the two halves of the book together. I don't think the sociological approach to ethics is inherently religious, but I do think my approach has, I love this phrase. It's from the sociologist of religion, Max Weber. He's one of the classic sociologists. And he had this phrase, elective affinity. And I think my approach has a kind of an elective affinity with progressive Christianity, not least because progressive Christianity finds value and wisdom in science, including in the social sciences. So using sociological thinking in the service of Jesus's vision feels both a little odd and utterly right to me.
I mean,
In
I think
fact,
we should use every type of science, in the service of
absolutely.
the kingdom of
Absolutely.
God.
I mean,
what a concept.
Planetary flourishing is going to require a lot of use of the natural sciences and the social sciences. I often actually think of Jesus as kind of a proto-sociologist in his words and his actions, in that he helped people see in new ways what was going on that they took for granted, and he invited them to new understandings that might have the capacity to remake the world. And really, that's what sociology at its best tends to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciated your views on things like rights and justice, how they can be good and can be bad. So, and so in the book, there's a couple of different terms that you use pretty prominently. We've already talked about one of them, which is flourishing. What's your definition of flourishing?
So to answer that question here, I thought I would use the definition I give in chapter 1, and it reads this way. People flourish when we are encouraged and enabled to be and to become our whole best selves, to fulfill our potential, to contribute effectively to the well-being of others and to society more broadly, and to live joyful, meaningful lives that make a difference and leave a legacy. And I'm aware that that definition is really broad and again, even somewhat vague, but because I elaborated in terms of these concrete human attributes, flourishing winds up taking on more specific forms on kind of a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm.
And the example I use most in the book is embodied flourishing because it is so straightforward. Here's what I say about that. As embodied beings, we flourish when we use our bodies for empowerment, accomplishment, and delight in work, play, creativity, or other venues. We flourish when we experience what ethicist Marvin Ellison calls pleasure, joy, and at-homeness in our bodies. We also flourish when we connect with other people and non-human beings through our bodies. So that's still broad, but it's easier to think of what specific examples look like. And literally about half an hour ago, I was sitting with one of our cats, and the cat was purring and sort of snuggling me, and it was just this incredibly deep, joyous, beautiful thing. And I thought, here I am. This is a form of embodied flourishing. It really can be just that simple. And the book describes what flourishing looks like in terms of our emotional lives, our relational lives, our meaning-making lives, and so on. And all of them are at about kind of that pitch of specificity. So it's not that hard once you get into the book to sort of go, okay, this is what a good life looks like in terms of our emotional well-being, or in terms of our ability to learn, or in terms of our spiritual development.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to the practicality of it for me. I think all those examples, explanations are really helpful. So another word that you use is kingdom, not kingdom, but KIN-DOM. Can you explain to folks what you mean by that?
Sure. I did not coin this phrase. That the term kingdom of God was actually coined by a Cuban-American feminist theologian named Ada Maria Isase Diaz. And it's equivalent to the term kingdom of heaven that Jesus is reported as using in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, the Gospels of Mark and Luke use the phrase kingdom of God, but as an observant Jew, Jesus would more likely have used kingdom of heaven. Jesus lived in a time of kingdoms, and we don't today. It made sense for Jesus to contrast the kingdom of heaven with the kingdom of Caesar as Jews experienced it under Roman occupation. So that contrast, and indeed even sort of the Palm Sunday pair of marches entering Jerusalem, Pilate on the one hand and Jesus on the other, give us these really profoundly alternative visions of what the world should be ordered like, and who should run it and how should they run it and so on. So I don't like the term kingdom because it really just doesn't resonate with me. I don't live in a kingdom, but at the same time, I don't really feel like I could use a phrase like, the democracy of God, or, the nation of God. That doesn't quite feel right either. The term kingdom to me implies community, and it also reminds us of Dr. King's use of the phrase beloved community. So, we aren't building kingdoms now, but we can try to build communities. And in keeping with that notion of, the kingdom of the sacred, or the kingdom of the sacred versus the kingdom of, the violent occupying oppressor, we are capable of building communities of love, peace, compassion, generosity, and hospitality. But we are also, as we see every day, perfectly capable of building communities based on hatred, violence, cruelty, greed, and selfishness. It is much easier, in fact, to build that second kind of community. But Jesus invites us to build the first kind of community. And so I certainly could have used beloved community. I have a pastor friend who uses the phrase, the economy of God, which I think is lovely. But in order to stay a little bit closer to language that people know, because people are familiar with the kingdom language, I wound up going with kingdom.
It is a good term, and I've seen other people use it, also. So in the book, you say, we are to be Jesus in the world today. The details of the work of flourishing are specific to our time, and the language we use to talk about how to do this work is similarly contemporary. But the value behind this work, the vision behind this work, is nothing less than the kingdom of God as Jesus imagined it. So your book and the values behind it, underlying it, are very Jesus driven.
Yes and no. Part of the book is very Jesus driven. Part of it is secular and religiously neutral. The ethic of flourishing described in the first half of the book could be useful for anyone, regardless of their religious commitments or lack thereof. I think it would be more useful for politically progressive people, but it is not inherently Christian. I've chosen to tie it to progressive Christianity because I believe the fit between them is so good. Mm-hmm. My personal engagement with Christianity is not particularly doctrinal, and I am a religious universalist. I spent 30 years with the Unitarian Universalists before hopping ship over to progressive Christianity. So I don't believe there is only one true religion. Any religious tradition can lead to and support flourishing. Any religious tradition can cause or justify suffering. Christianity has caused and justified more than its share of suffering historically. And as a queer feminist, I'm very comfortable saying that conservative Christianity causes a hell of a lot of suffering today. But all of that said, I am personally deeply taken with Jesus's vision, whether we call it the kingdom of God, kingdom of heaven, or beloved community. I am absolutely besotted by his dream of a world of justice and joy, well-being and gratitude centered in a relationship with the holy. I do want this book to contribute to and further that vision. So for Christian readers, I think we are to be Jesus today. But I could also comfortably say that for Buddhist readers, I think we are to be the Buddha today. And for secular readers, I think we are to contribute to the flourishing of humanity today. Maybe this is a little weird, but I don't find any contradiction in those three statements.
Oh, I don't either. Not at all. All you have to do is read Frederick Buechner's definition of Christian to understand that. And I won't go any further, but yeah, I totally agree. So one thing I was impressed about is that you're donating 50% of all your royalties from the book to an organization called One Nation Walking Together. Can you tell us about them?
Sure. I have known about them for years, but I got more connected to them because they are one of my current church's mission partners. So here's what their website says. One Nation Walking Together strives to make a positive impact in the lives of Native Americans, a people that are underserved and misrepresented. One Nation Walking Together is an organization about people helping people, not a cause. By loading 53-foot semi-trucks that deliver up to $2 million worth of donated goods to reservations annually, One Nation Walking Together provides hope and services to Native Americans in Colorado and 7 surrounding states. Their URL is https://www.onenationwt.org. The WT stands for Walking Together. And there's a slash after the org. So I've long donated money I made from my music to racial justice organizations. And traditionally, I donate it to organizations that support African American communities. But I felt a leading to do something a little different with this book. And the donation idea came to me while I was writing the land acknowledgement with which the book begins, which is why the mention of the donation follows immediately after that land acknowledgement.
Very cool. That's wonderful. So I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about the whole concept of finding your next calling. From a career perspective, you've been a sociology professor, a college administrator, but now you're writing books. So let's talk about what led you to start new things and how did you go about making that transition?
Sure. In some ways, it's been less of a transition than it might first appear. I'm still a college administrator. I still actually do some guest teaching. So my writing, my music creation, anti-racism training, and the other kinds of trainings I do all take place around the interstices of my day job. And I've known for a long time that my calling might not line up perfectly with my employment. I do serve people and academic communities in the context of my job, and I'm glad of that. But the creative work and justice work that gives my life its deepest meaning is not how I make my living, and I would not want it to be. This way, I have a good salary and health insurance, and I have the freedom to do things like give my music away for free and donate half of my book royalties to One Nation Walking Together. That's my choice. That's how it's worked for me. Different people have sort of different ways of blending those things. But there has been something of a transition in recent years. So my focus on these projects, the amount of time I spend on them, and kind of the intentionality with which I engage in them has increased really substantially. And here's some of the story behind that. In 2016, I was diagnosed with liver cancer, and I genuinely did not expect to live to see 2017, let alone 2024.
Wow.
The treatment that was supposed to slow the cancer destroyed it instead, and I've been cancer-free ever since.
Yay.
So that, along with some other health-related and emotional changes in my life, gave me a profound sense of urgency about making my mark on the world. And it also freed up a lot of energy and capacity I had not previously had, or maybe a better way to say it is that I'd not previously had access to. So there's that old saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And in my case, it was more like, when I was ready to turn my focus in these directions, the opportunities appeared. But it is also true that I became much more intentional and strategic about seeking out opportunities and noticing them when they came my way. Another big change is that I became willing to do things to support my projects that I had not in the past. When my first book, Queer Inclusion in the United Methodist Church, was published in 2008, I did nothing whatsoever to support its marketing at all. It was published by Routledge, which is a massive academic publisher, and I figured they'd take care of the marketing, and I just went on with my life, and it got out there somewhat. But I kind of look back at that in amazement, because I am doing a ton to market and publicize the book Abundant Lives, and I'm doing a moderate amount to market and publicize the book coming out this summer, Cultural Processes of Inequality. Because it's starting only as a hardcover, I'm going to withhold most of my marketing work until it comes out in paperback, because I think it'll start as a classroom book, but once it's out in paper, I think it'll have a much wider audience. So I expect to come back and do all of this kind of marketing for it in, a year and a half, whenever they put that out. So I would say that a number of personal changes in my life drove my desire or willingness or need to focus on these projects to a new extent and with a new intensity. As for the transition, it almost feels as though it occurred organically. That while there were a lot of concrete steps I had to take and things I had to learn, it all flowed from the intention. So it feels less like I took steps to make a transition and more like I finally got out of my own way and let the creativity flow at the pitch it wanted to, sort of like water seeking its natural level. Because I've written music for decades. I put out my third album shortly after the cancer scare. As I've mentioned a couple of times, I had a book published by a big academic publisher more than a decade ago, but I never had the focus I have now, or the willingness to do things like learn how to market my work, or the capacity to see how ideas I've had across my life intersect with one another. It's just all working on a whole new level. And again, I think a mix of health and emotional situations over the past few years made that possible. And there's one more thing I'd say about this, which is a little bit awkward. I totally wish COVID had never happened. And I still grieve all the harm it's caused and all the people it's killed, some of whom I personally know or knew. But it is also true that COVID turned out to spur my creative life and opportunities in important and unpredictable ways. So a main thing I did with my time during COVID was write a ton of free use progressive sacred music that churches could use in online services without spending money on it, without registering it or reporting it anywhere. So churches could use these videos in their online services, or they could download scores if they couldn't afford a music director. And because I not only wrote that music, but put it out to all these communities that needed it, this introduced me to huge networks of progressive religious people, many of whom later became really valuable contacts for Abundant Lives. I'll tell you one story about that in a few minutes in answer to another question. But it's, again, I find it really awkward to say this, but COVID, which was such a nightmare for so many people and has been such a devastating phenomenon, for me became this opportunity to just give back a lot. And that then helped facilitate what I'm doing now.
Hmm. Well, you mentioned another very Buechner-esque aspect of that, paying attention to opportunities,
Mm,
right?
right.
I mean, and you've turned lemons into lemonade too, so that's a wonderful thing.
Mm.
So let's talk about discernment a little bit, kind of like the decision-making process around, okay, do I do this? Do I do that? Are there any particular people or processes or reference materials that you found helpful in your discernment?
So I cannot overstate the importance of self-awareness, psychological healing work, and spiritual formation. And I recognize that these are really different for different people. But when I reflect on the past few years, my limitation in the past was never a lack of ability to accomplish things. It was a lack of understanding about myself, what I wanted, my strengths and weaknesses, how to prioritize, how to make myself learn about things that frightened or bothered me, like marketing. When we're too filled up with ourselves, our preoccupations, our fears, and our egos, we don't have space to listen well and learn. And in recent years, I found myself newly able to listen to my inner yearnings and follow them, even when doing so is challenging, scary, or exhausting. Then in terms of resources, I have to name you, Brian, specifically, because you have personally been extremely helpful to me, both in terms of the trainings you've offered that I've taken and some of the networking that you've made possible. So let me take this moment to just thank you deeply for that before I go
Well,
on.
thank you. Thank you.
Oh,
Appreciate
absolutely. You know, then a couple other things. I have found the idea of strength-based discernment very helpful. I'm sure you've heard that line about how some people are better with ideas, others with material things, and still others with people. You're an ideas person, you're a things person, you're a people person, that kind of thing. And I'm sure that's oversimplified and that some people are really skilled in two or even all three areas. But I think one thing I realized during my time of transition a few years ago was that my greatest strength as a thinker and a creator and a servant of the world was really in the area of ideas.
Hmm.
I like to think of myself as being pretty good with people, but that runs a way distant second to being good with ideas, whether those are academic, musical, or religious. And this makes sense. I've spent decades reading widely, developing my writing and musical skills, educating myself in a range of academic and other areas. I have degrees in comparative religion and sociology, and I have a seminary degree. So there's a lot of input that has sort of developed there over the years. And these days, it's leading to a lot of output. So the first thing I would say to people trying to figure out their next thing is to start with their gifts, strengths, and talents. What do other people think they do well? Where have they received the most positive feedback in their lives? Are they primarily an ideas person, a things person, or a person, people person, I guess, rather? Or are their gifts maybe at the intersection of a couple of these categories? And I think answering those questions is a really great way to start. Then there are two quotations that I think are hugely important for this kind of discernment. I don't think either of them will surprise you. The first is the wonderful quote from theologian Howard Thurman. He said, "Don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive and go do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive."
I
Gifts.
quoted that within my class, my
Oh,
Find Your Next Calling class and the online community discussion groups that we've had.
I mean, I'm
I love it.
sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure. I mean, gifts, strengths, and talents are crucial, but joy, I think, is just as crucial. So I heartily encourage people trying to figure out their next thing to ask themselves, what makes me come alive? About what am I passionate? When am I on fire? And what's burning in me? And the other quote, which you know even better, is from Frederick Buechner. He said, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." Now, this might sound like the opposite of what Thurman said, but I don't think it is, especially when I think about Thurman's own life and work. He was really a genius at bringing his deep gladness to the world's deep hunger. So I would say, to sort of integrate the two quotes, following Thurman, that we must start with what makes us come alive rather than with what the world needs. I think that's right, because the world needs so many different things, and most of us can't do most of them. And if we start with what we think the world needs, we might very well be immobilized into total paralysis. So yes, we should start with what makes us come alive, or our deep gladness. But then following Buechner, once we know what makes us come alive, once we know what our deep gladness is, it's time to discern where that intersects with all that is incomplete, aching, or missing in the world, where there's judgmentalism, violence, pain, war, people who feel inadequate, people who are self-destructive, all those broken places. So whatever makes us come alive is connected to our deep gladness. And so once we're really clear about what that is, it's time for us to find out where that meets the world's deep hunger. So that, I guess, is the last thing I would say in terms of the discernment process. Let's focus on our strengths. Let's focus on what makes us come alive and what our deep gladness is. And then once we have that in hand, let's look at what the world needs and how we can serve it.
I think that's an excellent approach. That two-phase aspect of it really makes a tremendous amount of sense to me. And, in today's world where, marketing is so much around overcoming the noise out there, just to build awareness of who you are and what you have to offer, you've got to focus on something you're really good at, and you're really unique at, right? Otherwise, you'll just get lost in that. And at the same time, you've got to be really passionate about it. And determined and persistent in order to, make it come to life. So, so I totally support, what you're saying about the importance of those two things first. And then, finding some place to apply it, right? That makes sense. That's a need, right? I mean, amen. Amen. I love it. So, you've been, at least toying with entrepreneurship, kind of a single person entrepreneur, a part of your life, for a while now. What kind of advice do you have for anyone else that is thinking about that?
So absolutely crucial. Build networks, cultivate friendships, serve others wherever and however you can. Find communities that want or need what you have to offer. And the funny thing is, I was told this at the beginning of all of this, of these processes, and I sort of thought, yeah, that sounds good. That sounds like what I should be thinking. But it's turned out to be utterly true for me. And I'm actually going to tell one story of how that has panned out for me, which is quite amazing, which is the story of how Abundant Lives got published and why you can hold it in your hand today. So I found its initial publisher because I was reading a book by a progressive Christian blogger whose blog I followed. And as I was looking at the book, I thought, I think the publisher of this book might be a good fit for this project. So I contacted them and they took the book. They accepted it. I wrote most of it, and then they promptly went out of business. And I thought, okay, that's the end of that. And I was quite dejected. And, I'm a pretty big Facebook person. So I posted about this on Facebook. And then the really amazing thing happened. One of my Facebook friends has a leadership role at the United Church of Christ. And I had previously written a worship song for his office during COVID. It wasn't a commission. I just wrote it out of the kindness of my heart. I thought, his office doesn't have anything like that. I can write them something. So I wrote the piece, made a score, made a recording, made a video, did all the things, sent it to him, and didn't think anything else would ever come of it. Well, this particular friend saw my Facebook post about the publishing company going under, and he happens to be friends with the managing editor of Pilgrim Press, which is the UCC publishing arm. And so he put me in touch with her. He promoted my project to her and sort of guided me in how to work with Pilgrim. One thing led to another, and now you have, the book in your hand. So in what sense can we say how Abundant Lives, the book, came to exist? It exists because I read progressive Christian blogs and books, and because I was strategic in noticing that there was this particular publisher that I thought might be interested in my project. The book also exists because I had learned enough about writing nonfiction book proposals and contacting publishers to sell the book effectively. But the book really exists because I'm Facebook friends with someone who knew someone in a position to publish the book, and because I'd already done something generous for the Facebook friend in question in the past with no expectation that anything would come of it. Now, when I give creativity workshops, which is another one of my side gigs, I talk a lot about the interplay between perspiration and inspiration, or what I call grit and grace. And I think this kind of entrepreneurialism is similar. There's a ton of labor, but there's also this matter of being open and awake when opportunities arise. Ultimately, I think there actually is no such thing as a single person entrepreneur. I think it takes a village for every entrepreneur to succeed. We might be at the heart of our own enterprises, but they very quickly become communal enterprises. So what I would say to other people is make those connections and find your people and do good things for them, and they just might do the same for you. I can't promise that will work for everyone, but it's worked for me multiple times, of which this book is only one example. And I should also note that this is also guidance that you give in your training. So
Absolutely.
Nothing that will surprise you there.
No. I mean, I've experienced the same thing multiple times, where, you'll build a relationship with some set of people, and great, interaction and, participation, collaboration, whatever. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there's all these opportunities to collaborate with that person or that group of people for completely other things that you never even dreamt of, of doing. And so, the serendipity of that, the being at the right place at the right time, whatever you want to call it, you just can't, I personally can't speak highly enough about the benefit of positive relationships with, positive people.
Yeah. And the one other thing I would say may sound surprising, and many people might disagree with it. I think it was really helpful for me to keep my day job, because for me, it has not, my next thing, so to speak, might or might not make me some money, but it has worked well for me to kind of stick with the balance I have now, as weird as it is. But what I would say to other people along those lines is keep your day job if you can find a way to do it, at least until your next thing shows evidence of paying enough to replace your day job. Maybe that's just my own risk aversion. Someone who is not risk averse might not do that. But again, that has worked well for me. So
there's a whole spectrum of, people's situations, right? From, being so tied down and so consumed, to make money and provide for a family and support their family, whatever they need to, right? So they can't even think about, doing something on the side, to the opposite end of the spectrum where money's no matter. They can go off and do whatever they want, and it really doesn't matter, to them in the overall financial scheme of things, right? And there's a spectrum in between that, everybody's got a different financial situation. Everybody's got a different risk tolerance, as you said, right? And so I think each person kind of has to figure out the balance that works for them.
Yeah.
So, you're just coming out with this new book now. As we mentioned before, there's another one coming out this summer, but I still have to ask you, what does the longer term future hold for you? Is it more books? Is it other new projects? Is it more music? What are you thinking?
Yeah, so I have a long list of hymns and worship songs I'd like to write. Some of them are partly written and I just need to get back to them. I also have a pretty long list of books I'd like to write. And how these books do may wind up giving me some opportunities to move on those books. In the somewhat shorter term, and balanced again with my day job, my personal life, and publicizing these two books, I also have some interviews on the horizon. I have a number of workshops I'm doing, some of them on topics we haven't even talked about today because I'm just kind of broad like that. So there's plenty of kind of planned stuff in the short and medium term. I'm absolutely open to opportunities emerging that I can't foresee. But since I can't foresee them, I plan to stay in my job for the time being, keep playing piano at my church, and just continue with the creative projects while I can. Whatever gets done, great. Whatever doesn't get done, doesn't get done. And there's one sort of final closing thought I want to make about all that. My brush with cancer and its aftermath really changed some basic ways in which I see the world. So I, of course, don't want to get hit by a bus tomorrow. But if I did, I would know without a hint of a doubt that I have contributed sufficiently well to the world and made a positive difference. If I never create another piece of writing or music, if I never give another talk or workshop, I will be satisfied with the difference I've already made. That sense of completion, which is one of the greatest gifts I have, frees me to move forward however I'm called to do so. So I think I know what that looks like short term. Longer term, we will just have to see.
Sure.
Whatever else is true, I expect it to be interesting.
Good for you. Good for you. Amen. So, Amanda, thanks so much for joining us and for sharing, more depth around all of your work and all the ways you think about your work. I think it's extremely valuable for people. Again, this is the book that, Amanda's just coming out with now, Abundant Lives. And you can learn more about the book at amandaudis-kessler.com and more about Amanda's music at queersacredmusic.com. Amanda, thanks again, and best wishes for all your present and future endeavors.
Thank you, and for yours as well.